Konstantin, thanks so much for your time. And many congratulations on the book, which is it's fantastic to see it doing so well. Sunday Times bestseller and everything. Maybe we could just start. I mean, it's about the West. What does the West mean to you?
Well, this is a very good criticism that people have made of the book, because when I couldn't call it what it should be called, which is an immigrant's love letter to the Anglosphere. So when I'm talking about the West, I'm primarily talking about the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia. I mean, Canada's gone off the rails a little bit in the last few years. New Zealand and so on. The sort of English-speaking world, essentially, which has a very particular view of freedom and responsibility, the role of the citizen, the role of the state. This is the group of countries that I'm talking about, where that most of us live and would like to continue living.
Yeah, sure. But there's a sort of common heritage there as well, isn't there? I know maybe not these days; they've perhaps gone off the rails. But there's something about the West that stretches back. That there's some connection in Western Europe, and I mean, you see perhaps in the issues with Ukraine and Russia, where there's been. Even though there are ideological differences maybe now, the countries that come together are the Anglosphere, but also the old other bits of the traditional West in France, Germany, and so on.
Oh, of course. And at the macro level, you certainly, when you abstract to that sort of level, you can certainly say the West. But I think one of the reasons I'm hesitant to make it so much about Western Europe, for example, is obviously France and Germany have their own philosophical and political and military and so on histories that are somewhat tainted by different things. The French Revolution, for example, results in a way of looking at the concept of freedom, and in a way that for me is not the way I look at it as someone who's British now. And one of the things that I really cherish about this country where we are today is, historically speaking, our understanding of freedom wasn't solely based on rationality, because rationality only gets you so far. And I'm such a big fan of Thomas Sowell's writings, precisely because of one of the things he talks about is the importance of understanding that the best way to predict what human beings are going to do is to look at what they've always done, as opposed to trying to reimagine the world from the ground up, which I think is more the French tradition. I'm somewhat skeptical about that, and of course, the Germans have their own problems, which we needn't get into.
So your book is an immigrant's love letter to the West. What do you love about the West?
Well, I've mentioned it already, of course. It's the freedom of the individual to pursue their own view of how they should live their life. The fact that people are free in this country, in America, and in many other parts of the West, to believe what they want to believe, to speak their mind as they see fit, to build their life in the way that they choose without excessive interference either from the government or, frankly, from the neighbors. This is one thing people don't realize about a heavily controlled society like the one that I grew up in the Soviet Union, modern Russia. There's a sort of, we had a joke, I don't know how well it will translate, but there was a joke in the Soviet Union is that you could never possibly have sex in Red Square. Do you know why? Because you'd get too much advice, because people are always in each other's business all the time. Whereas in the UK, that's one of the things that I find really endearing, is you will be left alone, sometimes too much, frankly, to kind of do what you want, and that thing of like, we'll never, tell someone to turn the music down on a train or on a bus. That's the negative trade-off of that thing, which is we sort of respect your right to do what you want within reason. And I think that, to me, is a unique thing that we have in the West that I think is really, really super important.
You say in your book, and I think this seems very true, Westerners love nothing more than people from other cultures telling us how terrible we are. I mean, given these lovable qualities about the West, these very unusual qualities that you like so much, why have so many Westerners, it seems, sort of fallen out of love with that culture and heritage?
Well, Britain has always had a history of it. I think it's fair to say. I mean, Orwell talked about the intelligentsia in this country who would rather be seen stealing from the poor box than standing to attention for the national anthem, or standing for the national anthem, rather. But I think in recent years there's been a sort of shift, and I do think that at the core of it is a sort of survivor guilt type of mentality, where we have been successful. And we now are able to access the fact that there are lots of parts of the world where people are less successful, and there's a very convenient narrative to explain all this, which is, well, we're successful at their expense. And of course, there's a grain of truth to that. You know, when you look at the imperial and colonial period, it's absolutely true that we've benefited from that, and there are countries that were damaged by that process and societies that were. But I think we've come to a position where, for some reason, we've elevated victimhood, and we've taken away and denigrated heroism and courage and all of these positive virtues, and we've made victimhood a virtue. And so now there is the desire to position the West as the evil oppressors and position everybody else as the victims of our oppression. And so I think that's kind of how we got here. And once you incentivize something, I always say people respond to incentives. So you see in our own media, for example, the elevation of people who claim to have, you know, there's a woman who goes around doing all the media, who is, as I understand it, the daughter of a Nigerian prince, but she, you know, her main job in the UK is to talk about how oppressed she is. This is kind of the way that we do things. And it works for the media. They've worked out that this is what people will click on, and so that's what they do now. And I think the conversation in the sort of quote-unquote elite, I question very much whether these people are actually elite, but in the elite discourse, this idea has been elevated so high that it's almost impossible to sort of break out of that paradigm. And so someone like me who comes along and says, well, actually, let's take an honest accounting of us and look at our history, both the negatives and the positives. You know, it was not easy to have my book published. I'm not saying I was cancelled or anything ridiculous like that, but I fear that if my name was not Konstantin Kisin and my skin wasn't the shade of color that it is, and I wasn't a first generation immigrant, but my name was Marc Sidwell and I was a British guy, I'd have a lot of a harder time getting the book published. And that's kind of a problem to me. I don't think that, you know, that to me is antithesis of the Western idea of people being born equal and should be treated equally and should be able to see what they see and say what they say. So I think it's this kind of pathology in our elite institutions that's become rather embedded, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, to challenge that.
In parts of the book, you're quite apocalyptic about the sort of the scale of the threat to the West. I mean, could you talk about that a little? How serious do you think the threat to the West is today?
Well, I'm not apocalyptic. I'm sort of just like realistic. I come from outside the West. I come from one of the two major civilizations that would potentially see themselves as a challenger to the West. The Russian Empire, which is essentially what Russia is. This is what people don't understand about Russia. It's not a country, it's an empire. And the Chinese Empire, who I don't know less about, but I understand some of the basic thinking. And the simple truth of the world is that, you know, someone's going to be top dog, and does the West want to be top dog, or do we want Russia or China to take over? That's how I always look at it. That's how people in Russia and China look at it, which is more important. And so I am not apocalyptic. I'm just sort of saying, look, well, the obvious history of the world is that someone is going to be the top dog in the world. And if the West refuses to be that, if the West is too obsessed about navel gazing and looking inward and introspection and solipsism, then you will end up in a position where you open the door to other countries and other civilizations that are entirely unembarrassed about their sort of quote-unquote heroic ambitions to be, you know, the superpower of the world. So I see a direct connection between what Russia is doing in Ukraine and what China is potentially going to do in Taiwan, and our own internal division and weakness and unwillingness to assert ourselves internally first and foremost in our own societies. And of course, you know very well, as I'm sure your viewers and listeners do, that both China and Russia have done everything in their power over the last many years to accelerate and fuel the division that we have in the West. So we have the incredible spectacle of the Chinese complaining about racism in the West, when literally putting Muslims in camps. It's incredible, but they want this, and I've been making this point. They want the division because they know it helps them. And so the thing that I'm quite frustrated about, as I think you can probably tell, is we in the West are doing it to ourselves. Instead of saying, no, the West is great. The West is great because we have these values that we're not embarrassed about. We're not embarrassed about the fact that we think human beings should be treated as individuals. We're not embarrassed about the idea that through a lot of hard work, through a lot of pain, through a lot of suffering, the MLK idea that people should be treated on the content of their character was starting to take root in our society. And we're not going to overturn it because a few radical activists want to defund the police or defund the family, or whatever it is that they want to do. This is what we believe in. And if you don't like it, there are plenty of other countries in the world where you can go and immigrate. I like the West. That's why I came here and made my home here. The moment I stop liking it, I'll move somewhere else, right? And the same for you. If you don't like what we have in this society, well, I understand. Go ahead. There's plenty of other places for you. We've got to be unembarrassed, Mark. And that's one of the reasons I'm using my immigrant privilege to make this point. We've got to be unembarrassed about saying what we believe in, what are British values, what are Western values. And I'm afraid we've lived through a period of time when it's become unacceptable to do so. If you ask a random person in the street, if you go out there and do a vox pop and ask people what British values are, a lot of them just run away from you because they think it's some sort of provocation. That's not the way that we should be as a society. There are such things as British values. There are such things as Western values. We've got to be confident in what they are, and that is the only way that we will continue to thrive as a society and as a civilization.
It's certainly been true in the past that it's drawing a contrast that helps the West to understand what it is. I mean, Second World War, there was a sort of renewal of the idea of the West as a way to gather these various countries together to fight the sort of the horrors of Nazism and Japanese imperialism. And of course, the same in the Cold War. You get Reagan and Thatcher talking up the West is very important. But we've kind of lost that a bit. And I think you talk about your immigrant privilege. I think maybe you see that clearer than most because you have seen both sides more than most to know that there is a real difference there. And somehow we seem to have lost that, or we're unwilling to see those bright lines in the sand or that difference in values. I don't know how we get that back, but it seems like maybe, do you think that's true, that we need that comparison outside ourselves?
I think we do, and that's why I tried to provide it in an immigrant's love letter to the West. But I'm not persuaded that the book alone will save the future of Western civilization. I think what will help, and I'm afraid this is a sad fact, and maybe something we should celebrate, is I think the fact that we can afford to engage in all this introspection and navel gazing is probably a product of our tremendous success in recent decades. The prosperity, the stability, the comfort, the technological progress, the scientific progress, all of these things have made us very, very comfortable, and that's wonderful. We'd all like for that to continue as long as we can. But comfortable people get comfortable, and I think that's kind of where we've got to. And when you get too comfortable, you encourage others outside of your society to see you as weak, and therefore to challenge your dominance and challenge your status, which is, I think, happening as we're seeing around the world now. I do think at least some of the elites in particular got a bit of a wake-up call with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think we're potentially about to get another one in Asia. And of course, as we all know, there is another wake-up call that's going to happen domestically too, with that prosperity that we talked about. I'm not sure how stable that's going to be. There are a lot of economic problems coming down the pipeline, and I think some people are going to get a rude awakening there too. And I hope that while these things are terrible and they will hurt a lot of people, as they have in Ukraine, as they will in China and Taiwan, and they will in our countries here, that is a bit of the grit and the oyster that I talk about in the book that people need, because we've got very comfortable, and that's brilliant. If those of us who have kids, we want our children to be comfortable and safe and all of that. But also, as you see with the younger generations now, when I go into a park and I see 6-year-olds walking around with helmets on, I'm like, I think we've gotten a little bit too far in the direction of safety and comfort, and we're unwilling to take risks, and we're unwilling also to stand up for what we believe in too. So there's challenges coming. They're going to be significant, and I think they may be the spark that we need to reinvigorate ourselves, or we will go the way of every great empire in the history, and we will fall apart and crumble.
Why, if you were trying to boil it down, is the West worth defending so that doesn't happen?
Well, we are unique in the very things that we've talked about. The idea of human freedom, the idea of the fact that the individual is sacrosanct and should be free from government tyranny, is a revolutionary idea, still unpracticed in most of the rest of the world. I mean, in Russia and in China, the idea that you as an individual have rights, and that you having the wrong opinion, for example, does not mean you should be murdered, doesn't really exist at a practical level. If you're a significant public figure in either of these two countries and you speak out against the regime, you are at best going to be forced out, or prosecuted under some false pretenses, or criminalized in some other way, or killed, or poisoned, or put in a camp. So the very idea that we live in a society where you're free to criticize the government, I mean, for all the faults of the recent governments, at least we're allowed to mock them and criticize them. I think that's really important. We are unique in that way. We're unique in the idea that we believe that at some level ordinary citizens should have a measure of influence over the policies of the government. Not a particularly common idea around the world. These are all things that we should celebrate. And of course, the product of that, these are not just like ephemeral ideological positions. They give us the freedom to pursue science truly. They give us the freedom to pursue business free of government meddling. And that means that we can build societies that are economically prosperous, technologically the most advanced in history. So it's not just this sort of abstract concepts. They have practical consequences for us. And if we want to maintain the technological and scientific progress, the wealth and stability that we have, we're going to have to maintain those. Other countries in the world don't have that, and that's why we're very, very unusual compared to everybody else, both in the world today and historically speaking too.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Let's turn to some of the sort of more controversial areas of history where people get sort of caught up in the crimes of the West and how we think about that. I mean, you have a chapter titled "Stop Feeling Guilty About Race, Whiteness and Slavery," which is pretty punchy and goes very much to the heart of the sort of big culture war debates that go on a lot at the moment. I mean, what would you say to those who just see the West as a sort of history of crime, and obviously terrible things have been done in the West's name or by its people?
Read a book is what I'd say to them, and not necessarily mine either. I only spend, as you say, a chapter on it, but I reference Thomas Sowell, I reference Orlando Patterson, I reference people who've actually studied the history of slavery. And my issue, we have this conversation about whether slavery should be taught in schools and so on, and my answer to that is yes. The problem is we don't teach about slavery in schools. What we teach about is the transatlantic slave trade. And this way of looking at the world is quite silly to me. It's sort of like evaluating whether a sprinter is fast or slow without comparing them to anybody else. You can't do it. You have to understand what was happening everywhere else at the same time. And I talk about my own family history of being slaves in Russia. I talk about what was happening in my country, what was happening in Africa when the evil Western colonialists arrived. And by the way, the transatlantic slave trade was absolutely evil by the standards of the modern day. But it wasn't as bad as the trans-Saharan slave trade, which was conducted mainly by Muslim and Arab traders. Didn't last as long, didn't take as many lives, didn't have such a high death rate, and slavery was continually practiced around the world much later, and only ended, by the way, thanks to the Western colonial powers putting a lot of effort and a lot of money into it. Does that excuse the transatlantic slave trade? Of course not. But it gives you the context to understand that the Western powers are and remain some of the most progressive, tolerant societies that have ever been created, and our crimes, which are many, there's no doubt they are many, should be seen in the context of that, in the context of the fact that other great civilizations and empires around the world were doing the exact same things and worse at the same time, and we ended it. We stopped it. Does that mean we should we should be aware of the dangers of going down that route? Absolutely, which is why I fight so hard against identity politics, against saying these people are better than these people. I think that is the lesson we should take away from our history. Whenever you and I decide that we're better than other people because we have a certain skin color, or because we have a certain opinion, or a certain ideology, or a certain sexuality, that's when society starts to run into problems. So yes, let's have a conversation about slavery, let's learn from it, and let's move forward so that we can come together and stop thinking about each other as black, white, up, down, blue head, red head, normal, whatever. Let's just remember we're human beings first. Those are the lessons of history that I think we should really be learning.
I was very struck that you talk a little bit about William Wilberforce and the extent to which an astonishing man who, there's an amazing memorial to him in Hull, but he is a bit forgotten now, and as you say, not really talked about enough as a sort of leading that campaign for abolition of the slave trade. And
doesn't fit the narrative.
You think that's the problem there?
Well, of course. Yeah, because I think he's a major contributor to ending. If you want to talk about progress and progressivism and doing better, I think he's one of the people that really contributed to that. but we don't talk about him because at the moment the sort of what you in the Soviet Union used to be called the state order, like the state procurement, the sort of establishment procurement requirements now are not for that story. It's for a different story.
Just turning slightly more wide than slavery, and sort of British imperial history is obviously sort of much discussed as well, this idea of decolonization and the evils of empire, and certainly again there are plenty of crimes and violence in the empire, but how do you think the British should feel about their imperial history?
Well, it's a complicated subject. I think what I'd like the British, and frankly everyone else who talks about this, is to read more about it. I think we don't really know that much about it. We're not that well educated about it. I think as any history, it's the same with Soviet history or Russian history. There are great moments of shame in the history of this country and Russia. There are also great moments of triumph. They have to be taken on balance together. And we have to see the contribution that we made, as well as some of the bad things that were done. I think I'm someone who's wary of jingoism and sort of excessive pride in your country. Pride is not a great emotion, generally speaking, as an individual or as a society, I think. But a healthy appreciation, while also a healthy awareness of where we went wrong, I think that's the right attitude. I think I'm wary of people who think we should be proud of our. I think there's a healthy balance to be struck. But I'm also, my issue is I don't think we should be ashamed of our country. Certainly, I think we should be aware of the great achievements of Britain, the United States, the Anglosphere, the Western project, and also aware of some of the things that we maybe got wrong, and learn from history. To me, history is a learning tool, nothing else. You can't. Where I differ from some of the sort of more recent activism is I am deeply troubled and extremely opposed to the idea that you should be held responsible for things that people who looked like you, who lived in broadly the same geographical area, did hundreds of years ago. I think the idea that you should be punished for the crimes of your ancestors is an extraordinarily backward idea that was, as I mentioned in the book, sort of made anathema as early as the Torah. The people have for a long time have understood that punishing you for the sins of your children or punishing your children for your sins is a bad idea. It doesn't lead anywhere good, and the fact that we've flirted with that in recent decades troubles me tremendously. We've got to move away from that. History is a learning tool, nothing more.
Capitalism, to turn to something else. I think you've mentioned it a couple of times, and you talk about it a bit in the book, and it's how it can be a bit of a dirty word, the C word, I think you call it. And what would be your case for why we should take capitalism seriously, or be glad for capitalism in the West?
Well, it's a system that's unleashed people's creativity. This is something that's really important to me. You know my backstory, starting out as a comedian, now creating something online. Without capitalism, you don't really have that. You don't have the unleashing of human creativity, whether that's in the cultural field or whether that's in science or anywhere else. The reason that the West won the Cold War, for example, is its extraordinary ability to make scientific progress, to win the arms race, and that comes from an economy that generates so much wealth that you can pour all this wealth into the research that you need to win the war like that. So capitalism is a system that is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, and any system comes with trade-offs, but it's the thing that gives you freedom in an economic context, in the same way that freedom of speech and all these other things give you freedom in a more cultural and human context. So that's why I think, while it has many drawbacks, and I talk about them in the book, and those drawbacks have to be addressed, Mark. We have to be clear about this. In this country in particular, the housing crisis is having tremendous downstream effects on our culture and our politics that no one wants to acknowledge, and frankly this Conservative government or the ones before it have made very little effort to address. But it's going to have a tremendous impact on the birth rate. It's having a tremendous impact on people's attitudes to society. If I'm sure many of the people watching this conversation will be conservative leaning in their attitude. Well, if you want other people to become conservative, they have to be able to marry, start a family, and so on. And if they can't find somewhere to live without having to share a flat with 5 other people, you're going to struggle to make them into conservatives. I mean, Douglas Murray always makes this point, how are you going to make people conservative if they've got nothing to conserve? So capitalism comes with issues. They need to be addressed, but it's still better than an alternative.
Oh, this has been great. Thank you so much. We're just going to do a few quick ones just to finish off, if that's all right. Should we feel lucky to live in the West today?
Extremely lucky. Extremely lucky.
How optimistic are you about the future of the West?
Well, it's difficult to say because I find it difficult to separate my own inherent optimism from observing reality such as it is. So if you ask me, am I optimistic? I'll say yes, because I am optimistic. I'm a person who is temperamentally optimistic. I think we're at a crossroads, Mark, and the choice is very stark. Either we address the problems that we've got, and they're very big problems, particularly geopolitically, and thrive again, or we're going to find ourselves in a very dark place very quickly. And I don't know which of those two options we're going to take. I think it's a wait and see kind of thing. I am optimistic because I see a resurgent counter movement to some of the sort of self-denigrating, self-deprecating, excessive introspection that we've talked about in the course of this conversation. How successful that is going to be remains to be seen.
How can we make sure the West survives?
Well, we've talked about that extensively today. We have to rediscover a confidence and a self-belief in ourselves and our values. If we can do that, this is the point I always make. There's nothing to fear except our own behavior in this situation. We are stronger, we are more powerful, we're more technologically advanced, we're more militarily advanced than the rest of the world put together. We've just got to stop tearing ourselves apart. And if we do that, we've got absolutely nothing to fear.
Just quickly to finish off, how worried should we be about today's threats to the West?
I think that we should always be worried about, this is the point I'm trying to make, is it doesn't matter how good you have it or how weak the other people are. If you tear your own civilization down from the inside, if you tear yourselves apart, eventually a challenger will come along. So I think we should simultaneously be very worried and also not worried at all, because we have a lot of challenges out there, but we have every power that we need to solve the problem. We've just got to do it.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Hello, if you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.